Hi, this is my presentation for my course project for Humanities 303, taught by Professor Catherine Cohn. My name is Dustin Leisure, and this is the Industrial Age of Capitalism. First of all, the Industrial Age is a period of time that started in Great Britain around 1760. It later moved into other areas of the planet, and including the United States. The thing that makes the Industrial Age stand out is that all of the hand tools that we used to use for farming and for industry were replaced with power-driven machines. So we had machines that were replacing humans. The power loom, the steam engine, and a lot of times we found that this was done by large industry establishments, and they would concentrate these machines and they would build these machines so as to produce products. There were many industries that were affected by the Industrial Age. Just a couple that stand out: mining, textiles, steam engines, banking, oil and gas. But you could probably say that there were many other industries that were positively and negatively affected by the Industrial Age. It really changed everything in the United States. At the same time, walking kind of hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution was capitalism. Capitalism is an economic and a political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. There have been a lot of positive and negative things said about capitalism over the years, but capitalism it really comes from the root word capital, which means wealth. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of decisions in capitalist environments are made based around how much money can be produced from the best decision. So capitalism works by encouraging competition in a fair and open market. Its opposite is often said to be socialism. So a capitalist economy encourages private actions and ownership, whereas socialism prefers public or government ownership and controls parts of the economy. Right now in the United States, the way that those divisions fall is some would tend to say that Democrats tend to be more socialists and Republicans tend to be more capitalist. However, I don't think that that's a solid line in the sand. I think you'll find many Democrats that find themselves to be capitalist, and I think you'll find Republicans as well that buy into a lot of socialist ideas. Social Security and Medicare in the United States is a good example of socialism. So socialism does work, and it actually is part of the United States economic model right now, even though many would say that we are more of a capitalist environment. There's just no such thing as a pure capitalist or a pure socialism in the modern world. You'll find that a lot of countries are what we would consider broken democracies, where half of or a portion of the electorate falls in one bucket and a portion of the electorate falls in the other. So to kind of go back in time and talk about some of the things that were invented during the Industrial Revolution, the first thing I go back to is the spinning jenny. In 1764, it was invented by James Hargreaves in Stanhill, Oswald Thistle, Lancashire, in England. And one of the key development of the industrialization of weaving. So this gave us the ability to produce clothes a little bit more efficiently. Another of the invention was Robert Fulton's steam engine. Robert Fulton lived from 1765 to 1815, and he's the one that's credited with developing the North River Steamboat of Claremont. The steam locomotive was invented by Richard Trevithick in February of 1804, and that happened about 3 years after he, oddly enough, had created a road locomotive. His steam locomotive took off, whereas his road locomotive maybe not so much. The electrical telegraph was patented in May of 1837. Cook and Wheatstone are the two that were considered co-developers of the first commercial electrical telegraph. Uh, the thing that I found amazing in my research was that by 1866, we had already laid the first telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean. That's amazing now that you think that we're actually laying fiber optic cable, sometimes along the same path that we used to lay the telegraph cable back in 1866 to connect countries together. So we were thinking about communication across continents a long, long time ago. Also, the financial markets were affected in that the London Stock Exchange came into existence around 1773. There was a location called Jonathan's Coffee House where people would go in and there were commodities and people would trade and so forth. However, it became a lot more formal after Jonathan's Coffee House created a club with 150 other brokers and named it the Stock Exchange in something called Sweeting's Alley in London. There was an entrance fee, and they could then enter and trade securities inside of Jonathan's Coffee House. And this is what was considered to be the beginning of the London Stock Exchange. Across the pond in the United States, the history of the New York Stock Exchange really was created by an agreement that was signed by 24 New York City stockbrokers in 1792, and it was outside 68 Wall Street under a buttonwood tree. And the picture that you see in this slide is actually the buttonwood tree, and that's Wall Street right behind it. So the New York Stock Exchange was the New York City, or the very first company listed on the New York Stock Exchange was the Bank of New York. So 1792, the New York Stock Exchange goes back to. Also, another important thing that happened during the Industrial Revolution as it relates to capitalism is that in 1776, Adam Smith published a book called The Wealth of Nations. The book touches really upon some broad topics as the division of labor, productivity, and free markets. All of these things were challenges in the early goings of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. So I want to focus a little bit on the U.S. In the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, we had a population of just 77 million people. Comparing that to today's population of around 300 million people, it's amazing how our population has grown with the Industrial Age as well. In the 1900s, there were 30 different nationalities. 60% of the entire population were farmers. 40% were city dwellers. And I think you'll see that the Industrial Age has really completely flipped that around, where a very, very small percentage of people in the United States are now still farmers. The picture at the very bottom is a color photo from Manhattan in 1900, which I found to be not only compelling but indicative of what that time period looked like. Now, flash forward through in the United States up to around 1975. Capitalism and the Industrial Revolution have fully taken hold in the United States, and we're starting to see some of the negative effects now of capitalism. Between 1975 and 1983, in the United States, there were 3.7 million manufacturing jobs that were lost between the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, and West Germany. However, during that same time period, there were 3.6 million jobs that were created in Asia. In 1983, the cost for an industrial worker in the United States was right around $12.26 an hour, $10.41 in West Germany, and $11.44 in Canada. However, in Korea, it was $1.29 an hour, $1.40 in Hong Kong, and $1.45 in Mexico. So if you were to put yourself in a CEO's position, it makes so much more sense that you could save close to $11 an hour for every worker if you were to open up a location in Korea. However, it has such a negative effect on jobs in the United States. You'll notice there's a small graph at the bottom of the presentation that shows between 1790 to 2000, the total amount of percentage of farm jobs in the United States. We went from mid 90s all the way down to plus or minus We've the industrial age has really had a negative effect on farming in the United States. So there are some disadvantages to capitalism. So many people look at capitalism as being this perfect model, and it is by far a perfect model. So the top 10 disadvantages to capitalism, the first one is inequality. A small portion of the electorate has the ability to make money, whereas the smaller portion of the electorate does not. Or really, it's the larger portion of the electorate that doesn't have the money, and the smaller portion that does. With wealth accrues to only a really small percent in the United States. The other thing about that drives inequality or allows inequality to continue is that obviously those people are going to pass on their wealth to their children. They don't redistribute that wealth into the public. Wealth creates more wealth. And we have very limited government intervention, and that allows people to make more money. So a lot of people think this has got to be a good thing. But the truth of the matter is this huge inequality from the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor actually causes more problems than it does solve. Waste. In a society where resources aren't evenly distributed, there's always going to be the wealthy who have an excess of resources. Occasionally, these resources are given to the poor. However, the excess is wasted. We waste a lot of stuff in the United States. Food, clothing, and so forth. Millions of dollars worth of food is wasted by those who have more money than what they need, while there are many others who desperately need it. So we see pictures of these poor, starving children over in Africa right after we get done swiping half of our plate into the trash because we decided we were full. So starvation comes from this. If some have excess of the resources in a society, there's just simply going to be other people that don't have enough. So if you've got one person that has too much, there's got to be the other end of that where people don't have enough. There is enough food in the world to feed the entire world population. Inequality and capitalism cause that food to be gathered by the wealthy. Antisocial. If people are worried about what's in their own pocket, they'll avoid helping their fellow human beings because they're concentrating on looking after themselves, right? So people feel the need to put themselves first because they think no one will be there to help them if they lose all their money. So greed starts to develop. Why is danger a downfall of capitalism? Other companies will cut corners in health and safety restrictions, and it happens all the time. Because it costs them less to pay off the families of the people that die, rather than it costs for them to make the changes in their industrial process. You might find that staff sometimes aren't properly trained. There have been provisions that haven't been put in place to protect them from risk. This oftentimes in the early 1900s resulted in not only injury but also death. Monopolies are another thing that happened during the Industrial Revolution. And monopolies are the idea that one company is the largest in an industry and there are no competitors. During the Industrial Revolution, the great example of this was Standard Oil. So Standard Oil, so that they could lower their cost, they could undercut competitors, they bought up all of these separate companies that were their suppliers. And so the Standard Oil Company became this large conglomerate called the Standard Oil Trust. And it got broken up in 1911. The public outcry caused this to go to court, and in the Supreme Court, the United States ruled Standard Oil of New Jersey versus United States that the Standard Oil of New Jersey must be dissolved under the Sherman Antitrust Act and split into 34 different companies. Two of those companies you may sound familiar. Exxon and Mobil came out of the Standard Oil being broken up, which oddly enough, Exxon and Mobil have remerged now in modern days. However, there's another term that not as many people are familiar with as they are with monopoly. Monopsony, which is not easy to say when you just said monopoly, monopsony is when there's only one buyer. When one firm is the sole purchaser of labor services in the market, a monopsony can't hire more workers without increasing the wage rate. So when you have one large employer that is buying everything and employing everyone, then they control a large portion of the market, which drives prices down. Now, this might sound like a good thing, right? However, when that single firm has market power through its factors of production, this then causes a monopoly. So monopsonies are just as bad as monopolies. So over time, greed and monopolies have tried to make their way into our standard of living in the United States. In conclusion, nowadays we are at a crossroads. We have ridiculous amounts of wealth inequality in the United States. The Republican side falls firmly on the capitalist side. The Democratic side in the United States falls firmly on the socialist side. And there is and has been a loggerheads between our two Democratic parties for well over 15 years. The industrial age in and of itself was a good thing. Capitalism in and of itself can be a good thing. However, when you bring these two things together, we find that the negative sides of capitalism really start to take over the positives of capitalism. And I think we're at a point right now in the United States where we're starting to see that happen. Thanks for your time.